following episode contains racist epithets. Listener discretion is advised.
Ali defeated Foley by a knockout in the 7th round. Immediately thereafter, he walked into the teeth of a monumental decision. He was drafted, and then he refused induction on the grounds of his religious convictions on war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor, hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. What I'm going to shoot them for what? How am I going to shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail.
While fighting imprisonment for his stand, Ali was also stripped of his title, denied a license to fight in the United States, and denied a visa to go overseas to fight. He was in a much tighter financial bind than most were aware of.
I don't want to see the world heavyweight champion driving the Volkswagen, guys in the Cadillacs and making fun of you. So I'm working today, I'm hauling, right? And so one day I had to speak at Canisius. Heard of Canisius? Canisius, Fairleigh Dickinson, C.W. Post. 3 colleges at $1,500 a college. Pretty good money. So I broke my wife's piggy bank. She had about $35 in it. $135. I broke the piggy bank to get gas money to get me to the college. And I got enough gas and food money to get the $4,500, the 3 $1,500 lectures. At $45 would hold me, pay gas bills, light bills, till I get to the next college. This went on until the whole mess was over.
Inevitably, students would challenge Ali on his stand and his convictions. Remarkably, Ali more than held his own against students who had a far better formal education than he.
I'm saying you talking about me about some draft, and all of you white boys are breaking your neck to get to Switzerland and Canada and London. I'm not going to help nobody get something my Negroes don't have. If I'm going to die, I'll die now, right here fighting you. If I'm going to die, you my enemy. My enemy is the white people, not Vietcong's or Chinese or Japanese. You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Saturday, July the 25th, 2020. That was the voice of Muhammad Ali in 1967, when he was stripped of his title belts and banned from boxing for 3 years, and initially given a 5-year prison sentence for refusing to serve in the Vietnam War, having been drafted. He declined to serve on conscientious objector status that his religious beliefs prohibited him from serving in any kind of conflict. Next on The Politicrat, a very strong answer to those who say ignorant things like stick to sports. Why that mantra reflects the ignorance that it reeks. Next.
I was, first 5 steps, I was in 7th place. By the middle of the turn, I was in 4th place. And then when I felt pretty good, I said, okay, this is it. So I pulled the throttle all the way out for 12 steps. Then I shut it down. This when the hands went up. And the smile on my face was a smile of jubilee, a jubilant smile. I did not want to take this action. And I've been asked many times, did I regret doing it? And it's not regret that I did it, only that it had to be done to bring a point. Racist tendencies had to be addressed some way. I had to do it to make a change. I wanted to stand out very clear and be on a platform in terms of human rights issues.
That was Tommie Smith, the American athlete, speaking about his stand at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, talking about how he said he was compelled to act and put up the black fist salute on the podium at the Olympic Games in the race that he had won on the track and field during that Olympic Games. May have been the 200 or 400 meters, but whichever it was, Tommie Smith came out the winner, and he wore a black glove over his right fist and raised it in the air during the national anthem, as did his fellow countryman John Carlos, who finished third in that same race. Their actions of raising their fists with the black glove on it cost them their careers in athletics. As you heard Mr. Smith say, he felt that he had to bring attention to racism and the human rights violations going on in the United States. For those who say ignorant things like stick to sports, this particular episode of The Politicrat is dedicated to you. Because a phrase like stick to sports implies a very narrow scope, a very narrow attitude, and a very closed-minded approach to the world that you are living in. It's the kind of thing that someone who owns people as property and enslaver would say. It's as if you, whoever says this kind of nonsense about sticking to sports, are the kind of person who sits in an arena or sits at home and tells athletes, go on, play, kick that ball. Or, as Laura Ingraham of Fox News, that toxic bastion, says, shut up and dribble. And you can see the racist connotation that all of this takes on, the enslavement connotation. You all over there, go play, go dribble a basketball. You're here to entertain me. That's the attitude of people who say stick to sports. Well, I think that athletes should stick to sports as long as the idiots who say stick to sports stick to wearing the same pair of underwear every day. It is such a woefully ignorant thing to say, stick to sports, when the entire history of this planet, particularly when it deals with athletes, always has involved a heavy dose of activism and reality, and a society that always affects everything. Politics always affects everything. It affects every variable of life that we live. And sports is no stranger to that. And if you think that sports somehow is immune to politics, well, think again. Look back to the late 1800s and early 1900s with Jack Johnson, the African-American boxer who faced a lot of heat and racism during his time as a champion. Look at Jesse Owens in the 1900 and I guess 1936 Olympics, 1932 Olympics, when Hitler in Germany, in Berlin, was watching on. Jesse Owens won at least 1 or 2 gold medals with Hitler watching in the stands. Stick to sports? Are you kidding me? People were comparing boxer Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, the black boxer and the white German boxer, to a battle between the United States and Germany during World War II. Stick to sports? In 1947, in Major League Baseball, Jackie Robinson, a black man playing baseball for years in the Negro Leagues, was finally allowed by white men to play in the major leagues. And that's how I define it, because it's not so much that Jackie Robinson broke a color barrier. It is that white people, white men like Branch Rickey, who was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, I should say, in 1947, said, okay, we're going to let black men, or this one black man, come in and play in our sport. Now, for years, by the way, the Negro Leagues wanted to play Major Leagues of baseball players, Major League Baseball players, in tournaments and in exhibition games, and the Major Leagues would refuse. They never wanted to have any wind of any part of the Negro Leagues. The Negro League players were far, far better. And the Negro League players that started to come into the Major Leagues of Baseball weren't even the best players on offer in the Negro Leagues. You had much better players that never made it into Major League Baseball. Quite frankly, because part of the reason is the white men who controlled Major League Baseball did not want them in. And I think that's how we have to start explaining and using language. It's not so much that Jackie Robinson broke a color barrier. It's that white people, white men, decided, okay, we're going to, after years of not allowing anyone black to play in our sport, we are now going to open the doors for you to come in. And that is not to diminish anything that Jackie Robinson did. Stick to sports. How about Muhammad Ali, as you heard earlier there, with some narration by Gil Noble, the late great Gil Noble, who used to host a great program called Like It Is, coming out of New York City. Gil Noble and Muhammad Ali are no longer with us, but you heard that clip to open this podcast episode, and Muhammad Ali was talking in 1967 about why he refused, and why he did refuse and did not serve a single day in Vietnam. As a conscientious objector, he had been drafted by the U.S. military, and he said, hell no, I won't go. And he gave, as you heard, very conclusive reasons why. Reasons that make perfect sense to me. For that, he lost his license to box. He was banned for 3 years. He was stripped of his heavyweight title belts and had been given a 5-year jail sentence. And he was able to appeal the sentence and all of those things and the decision to strip his belts. And that basically kept him out of prison. And after those 3 years of not being in the sport of boxing were up, he happened to, in his return to boxing, happened in 1970, happened to get a Supreme Court decision in that reversed his conviction for conscientious objector status. Reversed the conviction. Now, he had already been stripped of the belts and stripped of 3 years of his life in terms of boxing. But there was a small victory as the Supreme Court overturned the ruling against him. stick to sports. Muhammad Ali ended up winning those belts back, by the way. How about, as I said, Tommy Smith and John Carlos? I told you about them just now. And their careers were ended, by the way. Ended. Because they dared to shine a light in the middle of a very volatile year. I mean, did anybody remember 1968? 1968 was only the most turbulent year, arguably the most turbulent year of the 1960s. I mean, there were others for sure, 1964, 1965, for sure. Now, don't get me wrong. But my goodness me, 1968, you could make the case, and I will make the case, that 1968 was the most turbulent year that the 60s had seen. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that, quite frankly. Because when you think about it, look at what happened in that 1 year. Look at what happened in that 1 year. You had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., April of that year. 2 months later, you had the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, RFK. That same year, you had the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, one of the most incredible scenes that you would ever see at a political convention in your life. Violence inside the convention hall in Chicago, violence outside the convention hall in Chicago. 1968, I believe, was the same year of the Orangeburg massacre. May have been 66 or 67, if not 68. 68 was also the year that Lyndon Johnson, who was in the White House at the time, said that he would not seek another term in office and declined to accept the nomination that he almost certainly would have got, even with all the turbulence for the Democratic presidential nominee. I mean, he would almost certainly have got that. Then there was the whole combustible situation with the election in 68. Hubert Humphrey and the fight with him and Eugene McCarthy and all of that, and Nixon and Law and Order and all these kinds of things. 1968 was a very turbulent year, and in that Summer Olympics in 1968, October of that year, you had all of this going on. And with all of the racism that was all over the United States, in stepped Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and in that October night, they made a stand. And that stand that they took guts. Cost them their whole careers. They lost the rest of their careers. And they were only, I think, in their late 20s or early 30s. I mean, maybe their late 20s. I mean, they still had a lot of career left, or a good number of years left. And because they took a stand, you had a country called the United States of America who resented certain people in it, namely white Americans, who resented, and the people in the white power structure, who resented. How dare Tommy Smith and John Carlos raise their fists with a black glove on it, emphasizing black liberation and black power. How dare they? That was the posture of a lot of white people in the country at the time. Just like a lot of white people in America at the time, just the year before, turned on Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, for many people who weren't around at the time, these days is looked at as a beloved figure. The media love him. Everybody loves Ali. movies made about him, documentaries made about him. Michael Mann's rather disjointed and quite frankly disingenuous Ali came out in 2001, featured a pretty decent performance by Will Smith, which got nominated for an Academy Award the following year, 2002. But the movie itself was disjointed. All of these bouquets thrown at Ali, you would have thought that Ali and all the commercials and the nice, cute TV commercials, you would have thought that Muhammad Ali was a beloved folk hero. Well, he was, but that was not always the case. In 1967, in the heat of the Vietnam War, Muhammad Ali had death threats, thrown at him all the time. It was just incessant. The press ripped him. Everybody had an opinion about Muhammad Ali, and those who didn't like him made him know it. He got into it, as you heard earlier on in this episode. You heard the audio. He got into it with some white students. And some of these white students would, get in his face and challenge him and say, hey, what the heck are you doing? He got a lot of backlash, and he held his own, as you heard, stood up to these white students, white male students who, how dare you? This anger, holding on to something. What are you holding on to? Why are you shouting, how dare you, at Muhammad Ali? And he's made more sacrifices than these white male kids would ever sacrifice, will ever realize or know. And yet they're shouting at him. What are you angry about and what are you holding on to? It makes very little sense to me. Stick to sports? Really, that kind of posture reflects an ignorance and narrow-mindedness and a mentality of go, 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 play, play, play. You're here to entertain me. That kind of thing. And you sit there with your arms folded across your chest and you don't have to think about anything. Because for you, sports is an escape from your troubles. And while athletes work hard in their sports and work hard for their paychecks, for the very most part, they have to perform all the time under tremendous duress at times. But all you have to do is plop yourself on a couch and point out, why don't you go and perform? I don't want to hear what you have to say. So you are encouraging and championing ignorance. Whether you agree or disagree with what someone in the sporting world says, and Lord knows I have, it is not your province to tell an athlete or anybody else, celebrity or anyone else, to stick to what they do. Why don't you stick to stupidity and ignorance? It's just not sensible to say ignorant things like stick to sports. Next month, by the way, Donald Trump will be throwing out the first pitch at Yankee Stadium during a Major League Baseball game there with the Yankees. So why don't you tell the New York Yankees next month to stick to sports? There's been a tradition of people in the White House coming to baseball games or throwing out the first pitch. We've seen that. We saw that in 2001, shortly after September 11th happened, the terror attacks. George W. Bush was at Yankee Stadium, and he threw out the first pitch there during the World Series that the Yankees played against the Arizona Diamondbacks. Stick to sports.
on board the Queen Mary, Jesse Owens, the world's fastest sprinter, is met by Jack Dempsey on behalf of the Mayor of New York. It will be remembered that he declined to accompany his team to Scandinavia. He, too, kindly replies to a query. How about your suspension after the Olympics, Mr. Owens?
Well, my suspension, I really can't say much about it because I was tired. I wanted to come home, and I really did. After all, I haven't seen my wife for 3 months, and I'm very glad to be back home to see her.
Well, well.
That was a newsreel from the 1930s, 1936 actually. Jesse Owens, as you heard there, from Movie Tone, and he was explaining why he was suspended, or at least what was the circumstances of his suspension from the team in Scandinavia. He wanted to be with his wife. So sue him, so sue him, so sue him. He wanted to be with his wife. And he was suspended from the Olympic team then. And I believe it was the 1932 Olympic Games in Berlin. Jesse Owens, 1936 was Berlin, I'm sorry. So I originally was correct, 1936 was Berlin. But the point is that, listen, to say things like, stick to sports, conveys such a profound level of ignorance. I mean, I've drummed that home here in the first half hour of this podcast episode. You cannot divorce politics from anything. And you cannot divorce anything from politics. There are always ramifications that affect it. Politics affects everything. It affects what you wear. It affects where you live. It affects what you eat and drink. How can you tell an athlete to stick to sports when you don't stick to any one thing in your life? Presumably you have more than one different thing that you think or say or do in your life from a day-to-day basis, on a day-to-day basis. Surely you listen to more than one musician in your life. You don't stick to one band or singer. Surely, no matter how big a fan of a band or singer you are, you don't stick to that one group or that one person throughout your entire life. You listen to all kinds of music. So you're going to tell an athlete to stick only to sports, only to playing a ball game? They're not robots. You're not a robot. So for you to tell them to stick to that, to tell Jackie Robinson to stick to that. Jackie Robinson played at least 4 sports. Paul Robeson, who people forget was also an athlete, as well as a musician, as well as an actor, as well as an author, an activist. Stick to sports. Curt Flood, 1969. Baseball. Curt Flood was the baseball player, again, black man. In fact, in all of these cases I've mentioned, every single one of them so far I've mentioned, all black men, African American. Curt Flood in 1969 was playing Major League Baseball. And of course, Jackie Robinson made that possible, as did Branch Rickey. I've already talked about that. But Curt Flood was with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1969. They traded him to the Philadelphia Phillies, and Flood did not want to go there. The Phillies, he said, had racist fans, and I'm sure they did. And I'm sure they still do, just like every other Major League Baseball team has a segment of its fan base that is racist. So he, Curt Flood, refused on principle to even go anywhere near Philadelphia. He didn't like the stadium. He didn't like the team that much. He wasn't a big fan. Philadelphia, if you remember, the Phillies had a long history of racism and a racist baseball manager. I believe his last name was Chapman. In fact, he was depicted in the film 42 a few years back about Jackie Robinson. Although it was more about Branch Rickey than it was Jackie Robinson. Oh, dear. But anyway, Curt Flood refused to be traded, and he cited that, look, I don't want to pick up my bags and go to Philadelphia. I should have the right to play wherever I want to go. And it's like enslavement to me. You sending me here against my will is like enslavement. Yeah, sure, I'm making $90,000 a year, which is what he was doing at the time in 1969, but I don't have any choice in the matter. I should have the right to pick my suitor, explore my options, be a free agent. This reserve clause thing, no. I mean, I want to be able to make exceptions. And this reserve clause was challenged as very restrictive. Flood said again, as I say, that this was like a badge of slavery, a badge of enslavement. I, as an athlete who has put in time, should get to be able to pick my suitor. And then my suitor, whichever baseball team or teams that might be, can decide if they then want to employ me, have me in their employ. And then I can make the ultimate decision. But I don't want to be traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies. And you don't even get your general manager to tell me. You get some mid-level or low-level executive at St. Louis. All these good years I put in for you in St. Louis, which he did. Curt Flood was an outfielder. He was very good. I think his lifetime average was 285. I know the baseball aficionados out there can tell me otherwise what his lifetime baseball average was, but I believe it was 280, 285, somewhere in that area. And Curt Flood took this fight against this restrictive reserve clause all the way to the Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court heard Flood v. Kuhn. Kuhn was Bowie Kuhn, and Bowie Kuhn was at the time the commissioner of Major League Baseball. And he was saying, no, we have the right as baseball organizations and owners to set the parameters for which players can move through the organizations in this league. We have a right to control that. And we have a right to set that as the employers of this game. And we should be able to have better control over that and not allow players to be able to just do what they want to do. And the Supreme Court sided with the baseball commissioner, looking at business models, looking at this, looking at that. And it's very interesting because Lewis Powell, who was on the Supreme Court, this is in, I think, 1972. Lewis Powell, 1970, I think. Lewis Powell had to recuse himself from that case. Remember, I've talked in many episodes about the Powell Memo and Lewis Powell. And Lewis Powell got onto the Nixon Supreme Court. Lewis Powell was the same person who wrote that Powell Memo, and that Powell Memo specifically talked about having business at the center of American government operations. In fact, having business as the heart of the country. There needs to be this emphasis on business again. We can't have these middle-class families dictating the heartbeat of America. Big business and business in general has to be the absolute final arbiter here. We need to influence the sphere of government. We need to have a sphere of influence here. And within 40, 50 years, they got it. Reagan would come in the 80s, and the rest was history. And I've talked about that before as well. But Nixon had put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court with that Powell memo. And I think 70 or 71, the Powell memo came out. And Flood v. Kuhn was quite a story. And even though Curt Flood lost, what ended up happening is free agency. Flood, despite losing his case, paved the way for free agency. And now there is a rule called the 5-10 rule, or the 10-5 rule. And that rule is that if a baseball player in the major leagues has accrued a total of 10 years of service, and 5 of those involve at least, 5 of those at least are consecutive 5 years, 5 years with a team, with one team, that player has a right to dictate his terms for a new contract and go somewhere else. That's what free agency is. That now is the case in all of sports in North America. It's definitely true in the NBA. It's definitely true in the NFL. That a player, when they are a 10-5 player, they have the right, 10 years, 5 of them with the same team, to dictate their terms and where they want to go next. And now nobody even thinks about Curt Flood. Oh, well, LeBron James is going to be a free agent. And he was a free agent, remember, a couple of years ago, and the LA Lakers picked him up and said, thank you very much. Might have been last year, actually. Wasn't he a free agent last year? I mean, all these years go by in a blur. It could have been 2018, but one of those 2 years. Nobody even thinks about Curt Flood now, but it was Curt Flood in 1969 who started all of this. There wouldn't have been a LeBron James to the Los Angeles Lakers, or for that matter, a LeBron James to the Miami Heat, had it not been for Curt Flood. Curt Flood was an activist. He became very much an activist in believing in the right to union ownership, unions, and, he was very much on that idea of people should be determining their own destinies and not be pigeonholed or trapped into contracts. And it felt to him like enslavement. Stick to sports. How about South Africa? How about apartheid? How about Sun City? How about that song, I'm Not Gonna Play in Sun City, where you had athletes and musicians, sung by musicians, the song, I'm Not Gonna Play in Sun City, Ain't Gonna Play in Sun City. You had John McEnroe refuse to play in South Africa as a tennis player, tennis champion. Stick to sports. You had Colin Kaepernick. Didn't you remember him? 2016. Silent protest. Down on one knee. During the national anthem. So many people in this country were so angry at him. And there is so much ignorance. And no, I'm not one of those who says, I can understand why they were angry. I can't understand why they are angry. Why would you be standing for a national anthem that talks about talks about being happy that black people were enslaved? Why would you want to stand for that anthem? Why would you want to stand for what that anthem is about? Why would you want to stand for the person, by the way, for an anthem that was written by a person who owned black people as property, who enslaved black people? Why would you? Why would you want to stand for that anthem when you have so many black people being murdered by police? And murdered on a daily basis. Brown people put in cages. Colin Kaepernick sacrificed, like Muhammad Ali. Now, granted, Colin Kaepernick didn't have any Super Bowl titles, and they couldn't have been stripped from him, although we know that in some sports, due to issues that may have occurred or may occur in a sport, there are titles that get vacated. We've seen this in the NCAA, in the NCAA, I think, men's football. USC, remember, they had their titles stripped from them, or at least one of their titles, in that mid-1990s, early 2000s, when they had one of their titles or all their titles stripped, their two, because of scandal and whatnot. Colin Kaepernick, though, still to this day, 4 years on, does not have a job in the NFL. The San Francisco 49ers quarterback came out on principle in 2016. And he has been exemplary in his stand. But he has lost a lot for it. And the NFL had made an example of him, it's clear. The San Francisco 49ers actually supported what the ownership of certainly did. The ownership of the organization certainly supported what Colin Kaepernick was doing. The NFL itself did not, nor did the NFL owners, nor did the NFL commissioner. And now here we are in 2020 with what we're seeing all over this country now. A month or so or plus ago, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell supported the Black Lives Matter movement, but did not reinstate Colin Kaepernick. He only said, well, I think every team should take a look at Colin Kaepernick and try to re-sign him. So there you are. Stick to sports. Colin Kaepernick still does not have his job. And now you've got people kneeling in every sport all over the world. In fact, in Germany, 2 years plus ago, people were kneeling. On the football field for German football, they were kneeling. A year or two back, some of the NHL players, mostly black, and I think pretty much all black, the few that there are in the NFL, they were taking knees, or at least, if not taking knees, raising their fist in the way that Tommy Smith and John Carlos did in 1968. You have athletes all over the spectrum now taking stands. You have Venus Williams taking stands to get equal pay in the sport for women in terms of tennis. Stick to sports. You have the same thing as Serena Williams. You have Billie Jean King, a forerunner to both. Very much on the activism of, yes, we need equal pay in this sport. You pay the women the same as the men. Stick to sports. You had Martina Navratilova be as an activist. Still is an activist. She was despised by people in the United States. She was despised. When she first came onto the scene in the 1970s, probably around 78, 79-ish, 80, around that area, she was not liked. Martina Navratilova is pretty much well respected now. I know that there are some things that people have issues with her on. Her stand regarding, speaking of stick to sports, the stand regarding the female athlete who has been maligned because of apparently of taking steroids and this and that. You know the athlete I'm talking about. And I really wish I could remember her name. And, you have people questioning, well, is she a man? Is she this? Is she that? Is that? Martina Navratilova was talking about this whole issue. It got her into a lot of hot water last year. Or was it this year? Again, these days bleed into one. Stick to sports. You have people, and I don't know if people remember this. I think it was Chad Curtis on the New York Yankees, who during a live television interview with Jim Gray, if you're a sports person in the US and you watch sports and certainly World Series, you will remember Jim Gray. I think he's still around. He doesn't do these baseball World Series stuff anymore, but he did an interview with Chad Curtis, and I think Chad Curtis said, I just want to say, not that he said F Bush, but he did something to do with either George W. Bush or something else, or maybe I've just completely forgotten. But he said something on the air, and it was not taken too kindly by several people. Which, again, I should have researched this before. This is not very becoming. But I say all of these things to make a point. Stick to sports. Come on now. All over the world now, you've got Black Lives Matter on the backs of shirts, on the fronts of shirts, on banners, on the outside of Fenway Park in Boston. Now, who would have thunk? Boston? I thought Boston would be the last place that I would see any professional sports team put the words Black Lives Matter on the side of their stadium, on the outside of it. And especially the Boston Red Sox, who, to the best of my knowledge, was the very last Major League Baseball team to recruit anyone black to its playing ranks, much less the ranks of executives, because there's still not very many, if at all, in the major leagues, and I'll get to that in a few moments. Stick to sports. Boston Red Sox? Do you know about 3 or 4 years ago somebody draped a banner over the green monster at Fenway Park? For those of you who know your baseball and know your Boston Red Sox, if you're a fan of theirs in the major leagues of baseball, do you remember that from 2017 or so, or 18? Someone draped a banner over the front of the green monster, and it said something to the effect of, to the best of my recollection, racism is as American as apple pie. Do you know that they had that banner removed, and I think they may have arrested the person who unfurled the banner? That was only 2 or 3 years ago. Look at where we've come to now in 2020. Obviously, George Floyd and that lynching before our very eyes has raised a lot of awareness, I think, amongst white people who are willing now to act, who cannot turn away any longer, who cannot ignore this any longer. As I said, I still think there's about 75% of the white population in the United States that is not waking up yet. Either doesn't want to, doesn't care to, and is just about, well, I don't give a rat's ass about your Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think, quite frankly, that is what is going on. But there is, and that's the issue right now. Yes, it's nice to have the 25% of white people in America, in my view, standing up like they are in Portland, like they did last night in Portland, actually. What an incredible scene that was. You can go on my Twitter handle at @thepopcorn, REEL, and look up those videos that I've posted there that people were tweeting out. Incredible. On Friday night in Portland. Now, I bet you half of that or all of that does not make the news on CNN on this day. I bet you. If I'm wrong, I will say so. But they don't want that. They don't want you to see that. And only 11% of people in the US have Twitter. So there's a whole another 89%, nearly 90%, 9-0 almost, of people who have no idea about that incredible video that has been shown around on Twitter. There's been 2 or 3 of really strong, good videos. And if you are not amongst those 11 or so % on Twitter, you will never know what's going on in Portland unless you read some online magazine or online web page for news locally inside of Oregon. Otherwise, you're SOL. Stick to sports. Really? Here's Gabe Kapler. He is the new San Francisco Giants baseball manager in the major leagues. Gabe Kapler used to play in the major leagues. He's a white man, had managed before in the major leagues, I believe, for the Philadelphia Phillies. This is what Gabe Kapler had to say about black people and Major League Baseball. And by the way, black people in the major leagues of baseball, there are less than 7% African American players in the game. Less than 7% of the players are African American. Now you have other groups who are black, whether they are Latinx, Latinos, or people from the Dominican Republic, but actually African Americans make up less than 7% of the major leagues of baseball. This is somewhat 80 years, almost 75 plus years after Jackie Robinson was allowed in to baseball. And now you have, all these years later, less African American men in the game of Major League Baseball than you had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and the 80s. Here's what Gabe Kapler, the, again, San Francisco Giants baseball manager, had to say. Stick to sports.
That's standing out to me is I feel like this is a good time to bring light to the lack of jobs in baseball for black people. So I've been thinking a lot about the executive teams around the league, and they're frustratingly underrepresented by black people. I was talking to a friend who's a beat writer, a reporter. He's in baseball. He told me that he knows of 5 beat writers nationwide, black beat writers that cover our game. That to me it's embarrassing. And so, one of the things that I think we can do is shine light on the fact that, yes, in youth baseball doesn't give the opportunities to black people that it does to white people, and that's not okay. But then the extension of that is there's no pipeline to create jobs on executive teams, in business operations in baseball, in coaching players themselves. Industry-wide, we lack black representation, and we have to begin to create those pipelines. I think these kind of conversations can be an opportunity to talk about those things. And it's our responsibility to do that.
Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.